National Institute of Virology. Dear friends, I always like conferences, meetings, and symposia. Conferences, meetings, and symposia give us a lot of opportunity to understand the advancement subject. I remember my collaborator in the US. He invariably goes for all the ACS meetings. And he used to tell me, Sabu, if you go for ACS meeting regularly, and if you attend all the sessions, you understand the latest advancements. You meet the stalwarts in the field. That prompted me to organize large number of meetings in my campus. Dear Dr. Priya, I organized at least 4 or 5 international meetings in the campus. And as a result of this, we have a huge network all over the world. And you understand the latest development. And you meet the stalwarts in the field. Therefore, conference, symposium, and meetings give us a lot of opportunities for growth. And if you look at the corona pandemic, we have actually, India successfully managed the corona pandemic. We are still facing a lot of challenges. So we need to have in-depth collaboration, in-depth research, understanding the disease, management disease, a lot of issues, the post-corona, problems. Therefore, a conference of this sort is extremely important. As a Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University, Dr. Priya, I'm really excited for your agreement to be the speaker today. And on behalf of the university, behalf of KSCST, Ramanujan Institute, I extend a very warm welcome, Dr. Priya Abraham. Sure, the liberation will be to understand the latest advancements. And I also appreciate the nice work being done by your institute. I carefully watch the work of your institute. As a polymer man, I often go there. Next time, definitely I will visit you. And again, I invite you for the lecture. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. And I'm sure this talk will be extremely useful. I request all the participants to be extremely active.
160 research papers in peer-reviewed national and international journals of repute. Madam, it's indeed a great opportunity for us to have interaction with you. And for your information, in this COVID-19 pandemic, our contribution from Mahatma Gandhi University inwards, we played an important role in establishing the COVID-19 testing laboratory at Kottayam Medical College. And also we have a biomedical center who is also approved, which one is also approved center for COVID-19 testing also. So with these introductory words, I request Madam for the talk, please.
Dr. Sabu Thomas, Vice Chancellor of the Mahatma Gandhi University, thank you for your very positive and progressive comments. And Dr. Radhakrishnan, thank you for your very generous introduction, and greetings to you and also the faculty of the Srinivasa Ramanujan Institute of Basic Sciences, the School of Biosciences in Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam, and all other young people who are logged into this meeting. I bring you greetings from the National Institute of Virology, which is one of the 26 institutes of Indian Council of Medical Research. And I chose to speak about this topic simply because we have seen how this pandemic has brought even the resource-rich countries to their knees. And we know how this pandemic has impacted on family, health, society, and drastically on the economy. And when we reflect on what this pandemic in this day of, high level of healthcare, high level of information technology has done, we need to look at how this had happened, how such pandemics can happen in the future, what can happen in terms of sources from where such pandemics can occur, and also the measures we need to take. In fact, a lot of my lecture will be on the last part, measures we need to take to prepare for a possible next pandemic. So before I go into the depth of the lecture, I just want to highlight a few definitions. An endemic is an infection that is present within a particular community or country. An outbreak, on the other hand, is a greater than anticipated increase in the number of endemic cases in that particular community or country. An epidemic is a disease that affects a large number of people within a community, population, or region. So epidemic is of a larger magnitude. Still larger is a public health emergency of international concern, wherein there's a formal declaration of a public health risk to other states or countries through the international spread of this disease, which could potentially require not just a nationwide, but a coordinated international response. Usually it is the WHO that declares a public health emergency of international concern. And the last is, of course, a pandemic, where this epidemic has spread to a very high scale, involving multiple countries, continents, and regions. So with those definitions, let me go into the rest of my lecture. Sorry, I'm having a little problem. Yeah. Well, are pandemics here to stay? When we reflect on that, yes, pandemics like the present one are perhaps set to now make us think of a new normal. We need to remember that we need to respond effectively so that there's least economic damage. There is no, and that no healthy economy can exist without a good, robust public health system. Active strategies and well-resourced healthcare organizations are the cornerstone of any future pandemic response, and global health security is as strong as its weakest link. By this I mean, if there are regions of the world where public health response is not geared up, where there could be a potential for outbreak of diseases, even if the rest of the world is garnered and ready and prepared to face future pandemics, one nidus is enough for it to spread to a larger region. And an outbreak anywhere, really today, in today's world where we call ourselves as living in a global village, can threaten all of us. And in the famous words of the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, he said, nobody is protected unless everyone is protected. So that is the cornerstone of preparedness. And I'd like to reflect on some of the deadly pandemics of the past. And I would go back to, I'm really speaking only from the AD period. And we have the Antonine Plague, which occurred in 165 to 180 AD. The death toll was to the tune of about 5 million. Then there was the Justinian Plague. You can see the numbers. The Japanese smallpox epidemic, which it was called, but look at the staggering numbers. Black Death or bubonic plague, again, staggering numbers. This happened in the 14th to 16th century. Smallpox, which continued to rage in 1520, claimed 56 million. Then in the 17th century, again, plague took its toll causing significant mortality. Cholera outbreaks that were many over this period, entire period. So there have been several major outbreaks, collectively claimed 1 million, yet again plague, another 12 million. And if we bring it to more recent times, in the 19th century, yellow fever claimed about 100,000 to 150,000 individuals. The Russian flu, which is influenza, claimed 1 million. Spanish flu, the famous Spanish flu, which is, among all the master of all influenza epidemics that have occurred historically, 40 to 50 million on a conservative estimate. Then influenza had many other pandemics claiming numbers in the millions. HIV AIDS, this is a cumulative number, not just in 1981, discovered in 1981 and to date. SARS-CoV-1, the first SARS that was detected in November 2002. Luckily, we were able to contain it, so the numbers were relatively small. The last pandemic, major pandemic, which started in 2009, claimed around 200,000. MERS coronavirus, which was detected in 2012, and we still have occasional outbreaks of it, 850. And the SARS-CoV-2, the current pandemic, started in December 2019, and we know it's claimed more than 5 million, and we are still counting. So will history repeat itself? The simple answer to that is yes. How and when is what we don't exactly know. What it will be, whether it will be a new influenza, a new HIV, a new Ebola, we don't know. Most likely we need to remember anything that can spread through respiratory route is very likely to be the one that could cause a major outbreak. How will it spread? Through mosquitoes, ticks, animals, or human to human? Again, human to human respiratory route, highest risk. We not only have newly discovered agents, but we need to remember that there have been re-emergence of old pathogens and old diseases often returning to be joined by new ones. And diseases, as I mentioned earlier, have been able to spread further and faster like never before, simply because of the high level of international travel, not just on work, but families and individuals traveling for business, holidays and pleasure. So the capacity for something that occurs in one region to spread very quickly, as we saw with this very pandemic, is humongous today. So I need to dwell a little on zoonosis. Of course, I know that many of you know about this, but we know that it's a disease or an infection that is naturally transmissible between vertebrate animals, and then occasionally, more often than often, but it's often rarely, it often happens rarely, it jumps the animal to human barrier and gets into humans. Animals, of course, play a big role, and these may be in the form of bacterial, viral, parasitic, or even yet an unconventional agent, and sometimes can cause a huge public health problem. And very often, when it's an outbreak in farming animals, etc., this can prevent efficient production of food of animal origin and create obstacles to international trade in animal products, particularly countries that rely a lot on animal trade and export of meat products, etc., dairy products. This can impact on the economies of such countries, especially when a zoonotic infection achieves a very high proportion. So where do these emerging threats come out from? 2/3 of the major infections in the past decade have been infections clearly of animal origin. It has been caused because there's been a rise in international trade of exotic animals, that the sale and the consumption of exotic meats from wet markets. As you know, with this very virus, it seemed to have its origin most likely from a wet market where there was presence of exotic animals, put together next to each other, many of them still alive, some dead. So there's free chance of spread between the animal sources and where humans come to purchase and trade. Another reason is where there has been intensive but subhygienic livestock farming. Increased urbanization with the agro-industry fuel encroachment into forest has led to increased animal and human contact, has affected animal migration, has increased the range of the spread of disease vectors. What was perhaps confined to a forested region now gets into the human species. It increases also greenhouse gas emissions and contributes to overall global warming, which leads to drastic changes in climate. And of course, we know that there has been, with our urbanization and building of expressways and highways, a large-scale exploitation of the environment. Sorry, I'm having a problem. Okay, so let me just summarize some of the zoonoses in the 21st century. Of course, some of them date back to earlier also. The SARS-CoV-1 definitely appears to have its origin from the bat and maybe got into humans via the civet cat. The H1N1 definitely in pigs and probably origins from certain avian species. SARS-CoV-2 again from the bat. Pangolin is a query. Avian flu from poultry and other migratory birds. The MERS coronavirus from dromedary animals, dromedary camels definitely directly to humans, but maybe origins again from the bat. Ebola maybe from primates, bats, antelopes, porcupine. This is very much prevalent in the continent of Africa. Rift Valley fever again from livestock. Zika probably from human beings. Nipah again from fruit bats. The plague is a bacterium. Plague is caused by a bacterial species, Yersinia, which is comes into humans via rats. Lassa fever, again a virus via rats. Leptospirosis, bacterium via rats. Monkeypox, caused by a virus via rats, squirrels, and monkeys. Crimean-Congo hemorrhagic fever, a virus conveyed to human beings from the bite of a tick via cattle, sheep, and goats. And Kayasnur forest disease, a virus via ticks, having a reservoir in monkeys, rodents, and shrews within forested areas. So you can see that this intermingling of animal species encroaching into forested areas really puts human beings at a risk of picking many of these zoonotic diseases. And that is why today, world over, not just in our country, we have the creation of the One Health approach. We recognize that 70% of emerging human pathogens have an animal origin. There is now a collaborative effort to attain optimal health for humans, animals, and the environment. The Integrated Disease Surveillance Program and the NADRS, which is in animals. These are surveillance programs that need to develop a strategic approach together to recognize any outbreaks in animals or in human beings. The Department of Health Research and ICMR is now funding a center in the heart of the country at Nagpur, and it is going to be called the One Health Center, capable of handling both human and animal diseases. And a center such as this will have the capacity to detect and hopefully inform and contain such infections early. So what are our responses to various epidemic and phases of a disease which could potentially, if not contained or curtailed, could go on to pandemic? So when we have the introduction of a microbe or let's say a virus, initially it has a very localized transmission, and if it is not recognized, it gets amplified by spreading to more individuals. And if public health measures do not come into place, this can become amplified into a massive epidemic within the region and could spread to other regions. And then, of course, it can escalate to even a disease that could potentially become a pandemic. And unless we have some of these containment measures of, anticipation and preparedness, early detection, containing this outbreak, control and mitigation, then only can we even think of elimination or, in a more larger sense, eradication of a particular microbial disease. So what does anticipation involve? One is forecasting the most likely diseases to emerge in a region. And today, while the pandemic has become somewhat quiescent, now is the time to think of forecasting. What are our regions most vulnerable for. We also need to identify quick identifications, have quick identification of drivers that would hasten the spread. What is it, if it emerges, could hasten the spread? What are the preparedness plans based on the past experiences, looking at the variety of scenarios which this pandemic itself provided us with? We need to have an attitude of constant vigilance and a proactive risk assessment. And I'll come to that in a little while. But we constantly need to be doing risk assessments. What are the risks of another outbreak, another possible pandemic affecting our planet? Early detection begins at the healthcare setting, at the hospitals, at the clinics, even in the private practitioner's clinic, where doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers have to be trained to recognize a disease that has potential epidemic capacity, quick reporting of an unusual event, quick isolation of severely sick individuals. And we must also remember that healthcare workers need to protect themselves, as we saw that many thousands of healthcare workers succumb to this illness, if you think about it on a global scale. And they all need to be well versed with the appropriate infection control practices. And from the laboratory end, laboratories also need to be having the capacity to have an early identification of a novel agent. And if they do not have the full capacity, they need to quickly liaise with regional and global labs so that we can identify and do appropriate containment measures. So containment would be the rapid and effective containment, which is as important as a good and a quick diagnosis. And that is possible only if the first responders are aware of the possible risk. Control and mitigation will reduce the further incidence of the disease. It will reduce the possible severe outcomes of the disease and death due to the disease, and will limit disruptions in the economic and social and political systems, as we saw with this pandemic. Two goals. The first goal is elimination, that is sufficiently controlling and preventing an epidemic in that area, such it no longer is considered as a major public health issue. That would be to eliminate it in that region. Eradication is a much bigger goal, where permanent elimination of that microbial agent is achieved worldwide. This is much harder to achieve. We need to have very good public health machinery, not only for intervention and diagnosis, but very good response teams. And this is possible mostly only when man is the only reservoir. And a typical example of that being smallpox. So I want to go through some of the examples of organizations and networks that have helped to monitor potential outbreaks and regional outbreaks that could stem into pandemics. And two major organizations are the World Health Organization, WHO, and the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, CDC. And they together actually work on the global influenza surveillance and response system. So I'm giving you examples of how they are doing appropriate surveillance and constant, relooking at the data so that they can monitor the influenza strains that are circulating in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. And this contributes to the making up of the new formulations of the vaccine every year. As you know, influenza viruses, because they have got a segmented genome, they can reassort. They can lead to antigenic drifts and antigenic shifts, which could lead to the formation of a new strain that may not be, a previous vaccination in an individual may not protect you in the emergence of a new strain. So towards that effort, the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response Team, or referred to as the GISRS, monitors frequent changes in influenza viruses to reduce influenza disease impact through the use of vaccines. And how they do that is, there are 142 national influenza centers, one of which is located in this institute, in the National Institute of Virology, and there are 6 WHO collaborating centers world over. CDC is one major WHO collaborating center. They convene twice a year to decide on the composition of the vaccine based on the strains being constantly received by these collaborating centers. They analyze the influenza viruses from different parts of the world, not only for the epidemiological information, but the antigenic makeup, which could impact on the nature of immune response, the antiviral susceptibility, in that are they sensitive to the existing antivirals that are in use, and the actual genetic makeup of these new strains, whether they are becoming more and more divergent. These centers also provide training to the different labs, training, retraining, and provide reagents, support, and advice, so that finally this leads to newer approaches in vaccine virus selection, so that we are ready for the emergence of a new strain. Because, as you know, influenza is something that is not just restricted. The influenza virus is not just restricted to humans, but is seen in avian species, the pigs, etc. And therefore, there's always a chance of recombination and reassortment of these strains for the emergence of a completely new strain, as we saw in 2009. So in this era of pandemics, where we know that variants of viruses are constantly emerging, particularly with RNA viruses, there has to be a constant surveillance. And the reason for genomic surveillance, now everybody maps the entire whole genome and we compare them. And they are, once we've analyzed them, we submit it into public databases such as the GISAID. Some of you may be familiar. And why do we need to do that? Because variants can have a potential impact on the diagnostics. Should the genetic makeup change so much to impact on the antigenic makeup, then your diagnostics may be insufficient to detect it. We may land up with false negatives. We may have new genetic variants that could contribute to increased virulence, increased transmissibility. Some of the variants may be less affected or less treated by available antivirals or even vaccines. Vaccines may have to be modified to be relevant to the emerging variants. And also, it may alter the interactions with the antibody in individuals who have been vaccinated, who have been infected, and therefore the efficacy of the vaccine can be slightly altered with the emerging of these variants. So in the context of the current pandemic, many of you may have heard of the INSACOG. It is the Indian National Consortium on the SARS-CoV-2 genetic variants. It's now structured in a hub and spoke model where 10 premier labs came together, many of them from the DBT, the CSIR, and from the ICMR. We were one of those 10. And then each of these are, in touch with many satellite labs. These are premier labs, most of them in the government, that feed their data into these original regional genome sequencing labs. And then there are more labs that are being added on from medical colleges and virus research diagnostic labs. So therefore, we have formed ourselves into a hub and spoke model so that we can be constantly monitoring the variants of this virus. When we think of the laboratory end of things, what about strengthening our health systems? We need to have an adequate, fit-for-purpose workforce, suitably trained and with adequate and sufficient amounts of PPE. Adequate and appropriate health financing systems have to be there, And we need to provide support to our frontline workers in every way, not just in terms of providing them PPEs, etc., even psychological support. All the boosting of morale, because many of the healthcare workers were emotionally and psychologically affected by what they had to do during this pandemic. And all of them need to have access to the appropriate medical products so that they will be able to help in the combat at times of increased need. It's also important that we engage with the community. We tend to actually forget about this. Communities, when engaged, can be also frontline individuals who can detect and manage epidemics. If we engage with the community, talking about how infections can cross animal-human barriers, how infections can emerge, what are the basic precautions we need to take. Also work against a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that goes on. So if we can build trust and empower communities, they can help in the detection and can help in containment of an outbreak. And they themselves can implement mitigation measures in terms of assisting in change in individual and family and societal practices, and also community measures to contain what may be a newly emerging infection. So let us not forget that engagement with the community, not just once off, but in a continuing, in the form of a continuum, is very, very important. Risk communication, and this is a really, really important aspect of our preparedness. There's a risk assessment and a risk communication. Real-time exchange of information, authentic information, advice and opinions from recognized health experts and officials to the public needs to be given on a continued fashion. Today, everybody became an expert on SARS-CoV-2, but we need to draw on the experts who give their valuable updated opinions so that they are speaking to the public in a continuous, regular manner. These simple advices and information that they can impart can have a life-saving action in health emergencies, because there is so much of fake news going around. For instance, there were things about the vaccine could alter your DNA. Vaccine can cause infertility. Vaccine can, affect women's fertility. Vaccine contains microchips. This is the way the government is trying to monitor you. All kinds of fake news are running rampant. And it's very important that risk communication should be imparted by authentic, informed individuals to the public on a regular basis. And this definitely will mitigate the harm caused by an emerging outbreak. Infodemics is actually the dissemination of information, mostly fraudulent and misleading information that happens during a disease outbreak. So as quickly as an epidemic can spread, there is a rapid spread of this kind of information, which is based on rumors, gossip, unreliable, ill-based information that goes around. And today with the social media platforms, it can really rage through the community faster than a forest fire. So we need to be aware that there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that is making its rounds constantly, and we need to fight against this infodemic. And successful management of the infodemic is based on monitoring, recognizing them, identifying them, analyzing them, and debunking them, and controlling and mitigating the possibility of such unreliable, misleading, damaging information to impact on people's psyche such that they don't do the right things, but indeed do the wrong things in the time of such a health crisis. International collaborative efforts to fight such threats is, I can't say how important it is. And again, I'm giving you examples of some of these networks. The Gavi is a vaccine alliance which was created in 2000 to improve access to new and underused vaccines, particularly for children living in the world's poorest countries. The Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, the GOAN, is a network for rapid identification, confirmation, and response to outbreaks of international importance. And the International Health Agreement is an international law which helps countries work together to prevent, protect against, control, and respond to the international spread of a disease while avoiding the unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. Member states of the World Health Organization have a very important role. The WHO's World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Program works constantly with the member states to inform them and to guide them and to prepare for large-scale outbreaks. In fact, as we speak, WHO is constantly engaging. We have 6 major regions of the WHO, and each of the regions are preparing the member states in that region to prepare for large-scale outbreaks and pandemics. And at this point in time, there are at least 194 member states who engage with the WHO and are constantly appraised about preparedness for future outbreaks. Pandemic planning and response requires a risk assessment and a preparedness. As I said many times earlier, it requires and develops a commitment amongst the member states and the persons in authority within a country. It forms preparedness, planning, and response teams to cope with a possible outbreak. It helps to educate the team and develop a broader strategy that can combat an emerging outbreak. It assesses the risk, helps to develop a plan. Sometimes you may want to simulate a situation, scenario testing, what we call a test plan, where you simulate and see if we have such an outbreak, what are the different mechanisms we have to contain that. First of all, to detect, confirm, and contain it, to monitor the illness and implement a plan if this were to emerge into a much larger epidemic going on to becoming a pandemic, and then be prepared for even a next wave of that illness. And we've seen with influenza and with this very pandemic, this disease will come in waves. The waves may be big, the waves may be small, but we have to be prepared so that we are not, making a situation conducive for the wave to be extraordinarily large. There are 6 key ways where countries need to prepare. One is to develop the capability on their own to produce new vaccines, drugs, rapid diagnostics for novel pathogens as quickly. Speed is of the essence, within months. And you saw that even Covaxin, which we helped to make, was made literally under a year, within 10 months. We need to pioneer a strong and sustainable global health security system, build a deployable clinical capability to detect infectious diseases of an international character and which could lead to a real public health emergency. Invest more in robust, highly capable national public health systems in each country. Develop a national plan to harness effectively the national assets in event of a catastrophic pandemic. So that means we also need to think from the health sector. We should have enough healthcare facilities, enough incubators, enough oxygen generation plants, enough stockpiling of vaccine and antivirals, etc. Implement an international strategy for addressing research that increases pandemic risk. That is equally important because that's a very important facet of preparedness. And then ensure that national security response team is well prepared to prevent, I underline prevent, and also quickly detect and respond to infectious disease emergencies. So with this, we always talk about the new normal. We continue to adopt the new normal, where the new normal is a must and not an option. the use of masks, social or physical distancing, frequent sanitization of the hands, learning strictly the respiratory etiquette, avoiding large gatherings and crowded settings, especially in closed confined places, and taking the vaccine, whichever the vaccine, when you get an option. And I close with this wonderful image. Actually, this was out there in South Korea last year, where this is the image of sanitization, reminding the people of Korea to wash their hands. And this is actually made up by several drones creating this image. So I will close with this image as a reminder of the new normal. And thank you for your patient listening. These are the two campuses of the National Institute of Virology. This is the older campus where I'm speaking to you from. The newer campus, which houses the iconic Biosafety Level 4 laboratory, the highest containment in this Southeast Asian region, which did all the preclinical trials for the vaccine, which isolates all the variants of concern that we have seen in our country. And thank you once again for your patient listening.
This is a gain of function research, that is, you mutate the virus to make it more pathogenic, you preempt to find out that it may gain a new trait that and become more transmissible. So if we do such research and preempt, can we preempt pandemic by making vaccines or making new drugs for such variants?
So theoretically, yes, it's a very good idea, but this has to be actually very clearly regulated, because we know that, when we, today with all the genetic tools we have, it's very easy to make such variants and simulate what that particular variant could do and attempt to prepare accordingly. But the risk of, working with such, doing such genetic manipulations, as, one of the theories is that though we do not, I would still go with the crossover from bats into humans with regard to the origin of this pandemic. But we all know that even a big outbreak could be created by creating pathogens after genetic manipulation, which we will not be able to control after that. Particularly in countries such as ours, we don't pay attention to even the effluent. Is the effluent treated? It just goes down the drain. Where does that water land up? So I am personally, theoretically, yes, it's possible, but it's not my own opinion. This has to be clearly regulated. The IBSCs, the Institutional Biosafety Committees, will be held responsible for even allowing such experiments to happen. Have I answered your question?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Unnimaya, please. Unnimaya.
Ma'am, can you explain more about the One Health approach in zoonotic disease, combining zoonotic and the human disease?
So I think I elaborated enough. You know that, see, the more humans throw themselves into a virgin territory of forests where there's a crossover or a contact with animals humans have not had exposure to. For instance, to give you an example, there was a group of campers went into a cave which was full of bats. And this happened not here, but in America, where rabies virus. Bats are a source of many viruses. They themselves don't get sick. So rabies virus was transmitted in that kind of scenario, where they went into an isolated cave, which is, where human beings don't normally go into. So when humans get into pockets or niches of our natural environment, where we have no immunity to whatever is circulating there, whatever animal species harbors or are reservoirs of certain infections, then that would put us at risk. So that really is what zoonotic. And of course, I gave you the other examples where we do, first of all, even the climatic changes that we are imposing on our planet with global warming is creating all kinds of strange ecological and environmental upheavals in our country. That also contributes to, animals coming out of their niche and then coming into contact with humans. That's how zoonotic infections can happen.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
My question is this: that is, if we completed the vaccination and if after complete vaccination, is it possible to eliminate this coronavirus, or we have to live with this mask for the whole lifetime?
So, elimination is only possible if we all act in a concerted manner. We can minimize its spread and work towards, a low level endemicity in populations. But you tell me, people don't even refrain from, gathering at weddings, in churches, mosques, temples, everywhere, without any mask. And when we know that the current circulating variant has got a high transmissibility, the virus is just waiting to jump from one host to another. So this will be largely dictated by our behavior. So as the overall immunity of individuals increases, what we call herd immunity, and now that herd immunity has to be above 80, probably about 90%, to slow down the transmission of this virus. And that is hard to achieve unless people get more and more of vaccine, and also vaccine immunity may wane with time. So I do not see this actually getting eliminated, but we can bring it down to a very low level of endemicity. And until such time when we think it is no more a threat, masks will still be the way to go. In my institute, everybody wears a mask still. I'm speaking to you without a mask because I'm alone in my office.
Ma'am,
Yes,
can we predict the next pandemic outbreak using the existing bioinformatics data regarding the viral diseases and its occurrence?
Nobody is able to predict. As one of my slides said, when that will happen and from where, we are not able to say. But it's all about preparedness, gearing up. Like this particular pandemic has improved the testing capacity of hundreds, 1,500 government laboratories. And Mahatma Gandhi Institute itself helped with the establishment of testing capacity. And if you have RT-PCR testing capacity, that it gives you capacity to test for some other agent. These are generic testing tools. So we have to have a preparedness, not only from the frontline healthcare workers, from the laboratory side, from the public health side, from the community at large. We should be careful. We should not go and camp in the depth of a forest, where you have seen a couple of dead monkeys. You might probably one of you may pick up Cayasnur forest disease and come back because the dead monkey has picked up the infection from ticks who harbor the virus. And if you get bitten by one of those ticks, you pick up the disease. So we cannot predict, but we have to alter our overall human behavior and, increase our preparedness in the ways that I mentioned, not only healthcare workers, laboratorians, public health officials, and so on.
When we consider Kerala, especially in the active case of COVID-19 and also other viral diseases in Kerala, do we have to consider Kerala to have some unique features to be addressed?
Kerala's, I think, a whole overall ecology is very different from most of the rest of the country. But having said that, I spoke about Cayasnur forest disease. It was first seen in the forests of Karnataka. Now it is seen on the whole Western Ghats, from Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka, Kerala, and Western Tamil Nadu. Kerala has a very, very rich, foliage, and therefore a lot of what shall I say, fauna, and that is, and with its high humidity, all of that, it is conducive to the harboring of many microbial agents which may be seen in an animal reservoir, which unfortunately occasionally spills into human beings. And as far as mosquito-borne illnesses like Zika, dengue, chikungunya are concerned, or even West Nile virus or JE, Japanese encephalitis virus, again, there are public health measures that we human beings can take. Not allowing water collections to happen, either in our flower pots or old tires or, discarded, drums, etc. We should not, allow water collections to happen, because not just the ambient temperature and humidity, the rainfall is so high that these kind of collections can happen, which will be conducive to a multiplication of the vector, and therefore we become vulnerable to such vector-borne arthropod diseases as well. So it is not any curse on Kerala. It's just that it's a very, it's the typical equatorial forest. So you can see that that is very conducive to a lot of these infections to happen.
Madam, again, this COVID-19 condition provides some lessons to us to have more interaction, collaboration, networking, and also getting connected with more groups like microbiology, immunology, or epidemiology, and even to behavioral science, and also to material science to develop many healthcare products and so on. So whether there is any national initiatives to develop such network of programs for preparing for us for managing this condition?
I think from the government side, yes, there is a lot of initiative towards that. I'll come back to that. Even from the corporates, they are trying to link up, like you said, connecting material science to maybe laboratory science or direct healthcare intervention. So your comment is very, very relevant to this this topic. That we now is the time where we handhold, and there are no borders between specialties now, because we are all complementary. And from the government side, now when we are coming into a more quiescent part of the pandemic, we have already started doing workshops. We did workshops for Zika, for Nipah, for Kaisrur forest disease. We are going to start for Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, which was seen in Rajasthan and Gujarat. Influenza is happening constantly. Dengue is happening. So, we are now, even public-private partnerships are becoming more important than ever before. We should not have these independent silos. The animal group should interact, animal health group should interact with the human health group, because we are all interdependent, interconnected. So your comment is very, very relevant to this topic we are discussing.
Also, madam, it will be very good to generate more awareness on these things, especially regarding One Health approach, and also to manage these things. Is it possible for us to have more center of excellence or some particular specific groups in all the institutions, so we can provide more training to manpower, so that in case of any emergency, we will have more trained manpower, and also we can motivate more students to think about and contribute in this area in their research also?
I think so. That is a comprehensive approach. Garnering the different specialties in an institute are very important, which collectively can make that institute recognized for a center of excellence. And also networking. Networking is very important. We should not just stay limited to our institute and think, we keep our skills to ourselves. We network, we exchange skills, techniques, knowledge. As the Honorable Vice Chancellor himself said, this needs to happen. Now, we ourselves are going to apply for a center of excellence, because we have now taken it all the way up to vaccine. and we have many public health initiatives as well. So I think every institute should think of having a comprehensive approach to diseases. So I would actually suggest that your institute and the university as such should now be having One Health based conferences and meetings where you get experts from different specialties, so that we are talking together about prevention of such disease.
What is NIV doing to prevent an outbreak of Nipah, or what is the contingency plan that you have planned if Nipah becomes an outbreak? Like whether you are planning a vaccine, whether you are planning a monoclonal antibody like we have for corona, something like that, because sooner or later this will happen.
This is likely to happen, and right now as we speak, we had a few meetings about trying to make a monoclonal antibody. In fact, we tried to get some monoclonals from overseas, but it was not possible because in some of these countries that make monoclonals, it is not a problem for them. So the importance is not so much for them. So we have to become self-reliant. Another aspect of mitigation is every country needs to attempt to become self-reliant. So we are trying to, we have had some success with making monoclonals for SARS-CoV-2 and other viral agents. So that is an initiative as part of attempting to become a center of excellence. We will be making monoclonal antibodies and partnering with pharma to make that a commercial product. We are not thinking of vaccine just as yet, but if this becomes a more frequent phenomenon, we'll have to think of vaccine. You know that an initiative to a vaccine, a pharma company should be willing to make it because for them it is revenue, and not everybody needs to take a Nipah vaccine, right? So, but monoclonals would serve as a very good therapeutic approach because Nipah is the kind of infection, deadly as it is, it's not capable of spreading to, the millions of people, but it will definitely spread to everybody around that, the original case and cause very high mortality. So I think a therapeutic approach is very important because of the high mortality. So we are working on monoclonals.
Good morning, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is, we know that there have been so many lockdowns and protocols that have been put forth by the government. But even after that, after all these strict policies, what, on your opinion, is the reason for such a drastic spread of this coronavirus?
Well, there were lockdowns, there were all kinds of restrictions. But did you see what was happening in the early part of this year? There were panchayat elections, election rallies, pilgrimages, what have you happening with thousands and thousands, maybe lakhs and lakhs of people without mask and, observing no physical distancing. Added to that, we had the emergence of a highly transmissible variant. So the lack of public health and social measures adopted by our citizens during that time, concomitant with the emergence of a highly transmissible strain, really was a lethal combination. So that's why when you ask me, should we continue to mask, continue to observe all that we define as a new normal, I would say a resounding yes.
Good morning, ma'am. Ma'am, do you think our current system are equipped to deal with pandemics?
Our current system is not yet equipped to deal with pandemics, and it is about you and me working to make that difference. I think we all have to work in our spheres. Recently, again, Rotary came to say they wanted to honor me, the Rotary Club of Pune. And what I told them is, before any award, please use the audience, captive audience that you have to talk about how this virus and viruses like this can spread. So it's really, really important that the preparedness, the risk mitigation starts with you and me. Yes, government is doing a lot more, as you know, different state governments are doing. And a country as complex and populated such as ours, you will not see such fantastically tangible difference. But we have to gear up in that direction, definitely. As you know, now we are going to have 4 more National Institutes of Virology in Chandigarh, Dibrugarh, Jabalpur, Bengaluru. We have one here. So it has East Zone, North Zone, Central Zone, South Zone, West Zone represented. And we also have going to have a Central Institute of One Health. Every state, as I told you, has already developed significant diagnostic capacity. We have developed the capacity to make our own PPE. We have to be confident that we should make our own antivirals, our own vaccines. Molnupiravir, which is the new drug that is we are talking about for this virus, it's I think going to be given. It has a non-exclusive license, so it may be taken up by 8 of our pharma companies to make. So that gearing up happens from different quarters, but it starts with you and me.
Why is it getting delayed to get the WHO EUA?
So I think WHO is asking them. WHO pre-qualification is a very stringent thing even for a assay or for a vaccine. So they have been submitting their information bit by bit, and I think they still want some more, details of the scientific details about the clinical trials, which I think is yet to be submitted. For instance, now they want details of whether we used quality standards, etc. And that question has come to us, and we are, as I speak, that data we are submitting to BBIL. You have to use quality assurance standards, international standards. So that we have used that. So we are actually giving that to BBIL for them to submit to WHO. That's just one of the different, informations that WHO wants. Until all those boxes are ticked, WHO will not give a pre-qualification. But it's imminent. It will happen soon. Hopefully, we will get it before Diwali or maybe soon after Diwali. Hopefully. But that rests with the company, and they have to, keep furnishing whatever WHO wants.
Madam, there is a question from Dr. Anand. I read in some papers that after receiving vaccine, one should not wear mask for getting optimum immunity. What is your opinion? That's the question, madam.
This is a typical example of an infodemic, okay? Misinformation, and I would call disinformation, where there's deliberate dissemination of wrong information. We all know that even after vaccination, you could get an infection, which is called a breakthrough infection. Now, this is happening because the transmissibility of this virus is very high. It's much more than influenza virus. It is somewhere between 7 to 8. That means one person at a time who sneezes and coughs without a mask and without using respiratory etiquette can transmit to 7 or 8 people at a time. So even after vaccinating, you could get the infection, but the definition of breakthrough doesn't end there. You may get the infection, but you are protected against serious disease that leads to hospitalization and deaths. That is important. Because the virus is highly transmissible, you may still pick up the infection, but it may be mild. So if you wear a mask, you don't pick it up, and you will not pass it on to somebody who's more vulnerable, maybe somebody who's on immunosuppressive therapy, somebody who's on cancer therapy, somebody who is very old and not yet taken the vaccine. So you don't become a vehicle of infection if you don't wear a mask. But if you wear a mask, you are protected by virtue of your vaccine. And if you wear a mask, you don't pick up the infection because of its high transmissibility by, not observing the public health and social measures. And then if you pick up, you may not get sick, but you can pass it on to somebody else. That is why wear a mask.
Madam, as we've already agreed that the diagnostic capabilities all over India has increased tremendously, significantly, with every city having an RT-PCR lab. So how about NIV coming up with a multiplex PCR, RT-PCR kit from your own stable, which picks up all the fly viruses, picks up Nipah, picks up Zika, so that they can be easily implemented and used for screening any suspicious cases?
So we are already working with the multiplex respiratory virus, because as I told you, respiratory viruses are probably the most likely to cause major epidemics, outbreaks, and potentially pandemics. Yes, there are theoretically, you can throw it all into one tube and try to pick up, but then you remember the sensitivity also goes down. If you try to pick up from Zika to Ebola to Nipah to SARS-CoV-2, the sensitivity of that assay can be flawed. And that is why we have multiple whole genome sequencers that are available in our institute, so that even if we get a novel infection, we ask for the clinical material to be brought to us so that we can quickly put it into a whole genome sequencer and identify the agent. Today, whole genome sequencing is another very useful tool, so that from the background, commensal organisms, we can pick up a novel agent and then try to culture it or characterize it from there on. So for respiratory viruses, we are already making multiplex platform.
Madam, is there a restriction to private organizations in performing sequencing for SARS-CoV-2?
No, there isn't. But if you want to be part of the consortium, no, now they have stopped taking on more agents. You can do that. But remember, when we, whoever, be it National Institute of Virology or any other institute, starts doing whole genome sequencing, we should be very careful before we report it to the media or we put it on the GISAID, because we need to check the quality of those sequences. I'm constantly warring with the media. And I also argue with many of my basic science scientists. It is not important to just say, okay, now I've got the nth variant. We also have to look at its clinical contribution. What are the actual amino acid changes that could impact on, say, higher transmissibility or reduced protection by antibody? So it is not, I find many people are doing it for the sensationalism. That's not important. We have to interrogate a new variant. It's important to do genomic surveillance, but we need to have a sense of balance, and quality is really important before we talk about variants of any virus.
Don't you think targeted genome sequencing would be a cheaper and better option?
Yes, some people go for targeted sequencing, but if we know that it's affecting only one region, yes, that is a cheaper, more easier option to do. And you can even see that if it's particularly involving one region, you can compare that target sequencing with whole genome, and if the targeted sequencing giving the same information, that can be also done.
Madam, the question is, Sijo's question is about a Russian lab where explosion has occurred. His question is, how safe our lab is around the world?
Yes, so again, today, WHO is talking about risk assessments of your lab. Okay, so we have to see how are we discarding our waste. Earlier, I'm talking about 20, 30 years ago, people will do radio immunoassays, and they will just send the effluent into the drain. Okay, so we need to have risk assessments of how we are handling this. And so labs need to pay a lot of attention to that. So
Thank you
it is
very much,
very, no matter how big a lab, risk assessments have to happen on a continuous basis.
Thank you very much, madam, for your kind support, and we really know how precious your time is. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much.